I came to Lisbon for the Doc Nomads program, and within that program, what I'm trying to do in these 3 days is allowing the students to look at an object which is a film and take distance from that and try to see how it can become a universe in which you can navigate. So from a storyline to a story world would be, in a nutshell, the proposition. The challenging element is that when you are in a storyline, you have a set of events and situations, and you spend lots of time looking at the causality between the events. When you are in a story world, you need to think about the building blocks of your world and how your audience will navigate from one block to the other. The object I was calling, the film, is time-bounded, and the attention is in the frame. And what I'm interested in is how can we push the audience to look behind the frame, not only cognitively, but also visually or with other means. So one entry point is behind. The other entry point is how can we break the frame? We move from one element of surface to a tableau, from linearity to tabularity. I can give two examples. One which is a 15th century painting in which we have number of scenes and they are telling bits and pieces of stories. So it's a very old example, 16th century, we find that in a church. A more recent example would be a graphic novel. Let's take a page of an album of Tintin. What is interesting with graphic novel is the tension between one frame and the entirety of the number of frames. There is a tension between looking at the image and reading the different text in different frames. So the narrative is built up from one to the other, and the context and the visual ambience is your eye catching the entirety of the tableau. So my working assumption is that in terms of storytelling with screens and interface design and web pages, we have lots of things to learn from old paintings or from comic books and graphic novels in combination with film culture, which is working on a frame which is time-bounded. So that is where I make the combination between linearity and tabularity. And we can go back into history, and in Japanese culture we have the roll, and the roll is interesting because it could be the metaphor of the travel in cinema, the pan. But you are doing that with your hand, but you are doing a movement of the eye which is horizontal. So if we combine that metaphor with the graphic novel, with the old painting, we see that for 100 years, for the story of cinema in 20th century, we have been pushed to look in the frame. We know things are happening out of the frame. If we take Renoir, La Règle du Jeu, we know that lots of information is conveyed to the audience through the soundtrack, through people running out and in the frame. So we have many examples. But what do we do if we have many frames on one surface? And graphic novel and comic books have been anticipating in terms of articulation between fragments of stories and articulation between image and text, because that is another dimension we could talk about. The combination between textual information, which is read, which is absorbed in a different way than visual material. How do we play with that? And if we add audio on top of that, then we have a screen with what we used to call 10 years ago multimedia. What are the specificities of this type of language? So we are talking, for example, of a specific project in the university where they have to tell the story of two characters. If we are in a film culture, we would work a lot with the dialogues and things happening in the frame. If we come with new media culture, but where narrative is important, we would begin to look at elements of the environment, context, which the reader or the viewer or the spectator will need to, for example, click on to generate information which will help to support the narrative. That could be a kind of assignment. The challenge is to try to find meaningful objects in the context which bring and add value to the narrative, because the focus should be the narrative. Otherwise we do anything and everything. So the challenge is how to find the right balance. First, speaking about the screens, we know that we have on average 4 to 5 scales. We have the small screen of the mobile smartphone. We have the screen of the computer where we are leading toward, so we are in an active position. We have the screen of the television where we are leaning back, so we have a passive position. And we have bigger screens like the theatrical communal experience of being many people looking at. And I can add another family of screens, the public space screen. We go in a plaza, we go in a train station, we have. The question is, how do we make sure that story makers are thinking of using these different screens to tell coherent stories, knowing that they are fragmented in all these different screens? So that is one way of looking. How do we teach students so that they think of using all the screens for one project in a meaningful way? Another approach would be to select some of them, but to push them to use at least 2 screens, and to try to combine storytelling using different scales of screens, and try to again work on assignments where you have this combination. If we look into human-computer interaction, there is a concept which is called harmonious degradation. What do we mean by harmonious degradation? Is that when we do the design for a big screen, and we know that the viewer will at a certain moment read the content on a smaller screen, we need to make sure that the content which is shrinked remains beautiful and interesting in a small screen. So this concept of harmonious degradation is something we might need to develop in film studies and audiovisual studies. Because when, as a filmmaker, I make a film, I'm obsessed by my frame and the composition, and everything needs to fit perfectly in that. But when I'm in a more dynamic compositional mood, I can think of building blocks where for a smaller screen I will re-articulate that, but it remains meaningful. Does that add some insights into moving from static composition to dynamic composition, knowing that one part of the composition will be done by software, which is a big challenge because you lose control. And the core now in filmmaking storytelling is how do we do if we give one part of our control of composition to some software who are doing queries in database and to some audience who are doing user-generated content. We are there as a maker. Our role as a maker is no more complete control, but it becomes an architecture of storytelling. So we are stepping back and we are taking another role, which can be debated, of course. We have nowadays, and we know that when some people are watching television at home, they don't watch one screen, but they watch at least two screens. They have their television screen which is running, they have their iPad or smart tablet where they are reading emails or checking Facebook, and young people have got their SMS which is running on their phone. So the challenge for the story maker is, how do we build a story knowing the attention span is fragmented? That is the big question of the industry in television, is how do we make compelling stories knowing that part of the attention is there and in the eye and in the phone. One strategy is that let's put some part of the stories also in the Facebook page. Let's put some SMS which are sent to some addresses, and if they want to read the next part of a web page, they need to find the code on the SMS. So we are getting into modes for the last 5, 6, 7 years where multiple screens are part of the storytelling patterns, and combination are things which could be developed. Is it successful or not? There are one or two cases. I think in Finland, YLE has done a test. There has been something in Denmark. Some countries in Europe have been doing some test. The challenge is that if you do something in television, it's so dangerous in terms of impact, because television has a model with advertisers. So you can't do a laboratory with your big channels. I think in Madrid, the Spanish national channel did try late at night some combination where they streamed some content for second screens and played with main screen. So these are possible try out which are taking place. My remark would be, maybe we need much more, because if we don't try lots of different combinations, we won't be able to see what works and what doesn't work. And the remark is the following: this kind of test should be under the direction of the director and not under the direction of the marketing department. And that is where I feel we might, as film schools or television schools, or work more on how to make sure that the director of today has got experience with the different screens and think about putting bits and pieces of the narrative universe into the screens, and that it is not only considered as a marketing tools, all these peripheral screens, and that the story is happening only in one frame. So there we have a change of culture. Now, you are talking about the internet generation. Internet generation is used to consume many content in many screens. Do we have internet generation makers who are used to make content for many screens? That is a question we could put on the table and see, okay, what do we need to build capacity? And what do we need to make sure that they understand what is coding, dynamic layouting, and storytelling? If we begin to combine this kind of craft, then we might see new generations of makers, which are happening, but we don't have the critical mass of this kind of storytellers. In terms of guidelines, it's quite challenging, because we are in a moment where, again, we don't know what is happening in the next 18 months. In terms of usage, I have a rule of thumb which I call the 1-9-90. If we do a story space, 1% of the people will be active contributors. 9% of the people will be commentators, adding some anecdotes. And 90% of the people will be passive viewers. So if I take that as a working assumption, television for the last 40, 50 years have been working for the 90%. And then with SMS and all this kind of small interactivity possibility, you had the 9% which were able to react and to do something. But it was used for marketing, not for storytelling per se. And now with Facebook and some other channels like Twitter, the 1% is coming into the game. So if I give this rule of thumb 1-9-90, it allows to think, okay, what will they do? Will they act or react or stay like that? Now, based on that, can we think of story spaces where we can build on this type of behaviors? And then begins the genre approach. So if we have a detective story, we know that the 1% is or could be more active contributors. So they could be the opinion leaders spreading rumors and clues to some of the 9%. And then we are beginning to build tension. Because what is storytelling? It's building tension. If there is enough tension, then the attention is there. So the challenge is in all these fragmented screens and world, how to keep the attention and the tension. So which kind of mise en scène and dramaturgy we need to think about. Now, you might argue, okay, this is very generic. We are more on the conceptual level. How do we translate that into something more experiential? And that is where comes the work with small detective storyboarding, trying to test based on mood boards and shoot in a very light way and test the ideas, testing. So that would be, I would say, not a series of guidelines, but a change of attitude in making stuff. By that I mean, if we have to set up a full studio to shoot 30 seconds, how can we change the working procedures by shooting lightly but having these 30 seconds to see if it serves the purpose of the story. But we have the risk of producing one type of stuff. But one type of stuff may have lots of success. If we take the cliché of favela stories in Brazil and of Bollywood stories in Mumbai, they did lots of cliché stuff. But then the language became more and more sophisticated. And today in Bollywood stories you have fantastic things happening. People here may think that it's cliché and it's 3 hours films and it's dance, 10 minutes story, dance and so forth. But if we look at Bollywood today, it has changed. And I was in touch with people in India. The notion of transmedia and many fragments of stories in many screens is happening already, because first they are going into internet without television but with their mobile phone. So mobile phone is used to convey bits and pieces of stories, and producers are testing and trying ideas. So the center of gravity of the story is no more in the screen, but in a combination of multiple screens and the rumors. Webdoc is a genre, or a so-called genre. But if we look back into the history of hypermedia storytelling, we have got the ability to tell stories jumping from one point to the other for the last 30 years. Webdoc has emerged as a genre for the last 5 years. One of the reasons it has emerged is because television channels and producers are looking for new business models and try to use the web as part of their craft and their making. That is my reading of the webdoc as a genre. If we look at all the webdocs, we know that many of them don't have a successful business model. On the other side, if we go back now to the webdoc as a storytelling object, we see ways of articulating content which was already done 15 years ago in CD-ROMs, mid-90s. CD-ROMs and DVD-ROMs were showing stories, but the story was on a piece of plastic. What is the difference with web docs and this piece of plastic is that the story is no more on a piece of plastic, but is on the web. The question is, do we see web docs who are using the potentialities of the web? Because what is the web? The web is a distributed network. Do we see enough distributed narrative using the potentialities of the web and the computer to tell stories by giving new agencies? Not enough. We can have 2 or 3 examples which are interesting. And that's why I'm using the example of the CD-ROM, mid-90s, because many web docs think that they have invented the hot water, but let's be careful. It has existed in terms of writing, in terms of articulation, in terms of agency for mid-80s, mid-90s, 2005. We have already 3 generations of hypermedia storytelling. WebDoc is a reincarnation of something which already existed. The business model allows that for the moment. Is there originality in terms of writing? We still have lots of work to do. What does it mean? It means that producers need to understand the potentialities of the web. It means that film schools need to put in the curriculum knowledge about human-computer interaction, hypermedia storytelling, navigation into database, all these kind of practices which a so-called pure filmmaker will get nervous about because he's into linear storytelling. And we go back to what we were talking at the beginning of our conversation, the tabularity. How do we make sure that we have an attitude of thinking of building blocks and combination, and then inventing new connections? That is a challenge. Knowing that part of the connections are not done by the maker, but by the viewer. So we are into new reception theories, if we need to look into theories.